Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Lunch and Learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Georgia Archives. We are so glad that you have joined us for our November presentation, The First World War, Why It Still Matters, presented by Gary Gill. Gary is a lifelong resident of Thomaston, Georgia. He graduated high school from R.E. Lee Institute and received a bachelor's degree in education from the University of Georgia and master's and education specialist degrees from Georgia College and State University. For 33 years, he taught high school social studies, mostly US and world history. Gary has been a member of the Upson Historical Society for 39 years and is presently on the board of directors as vice president. Gary is also in charge of the Upson Historical Society's annual Veterans Day program. Now, if you have friends or family who are unable to view this webinar, they still can enjoy this program as it will be uploaded to the Georgia Archives YouTube channel. You may ask Gary any questions at the end of the presentation. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Penny, for that introduction. I hope I'm not freaking you out wearing this mask, because I don't intend to wear it the whole time. But if you're asking the question why World War I still matters, I think our present condition could start with a mask. Because as you know, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. But right at the end of World War I, the great Spanish influenza pandemic occurred, and it would not be unusual to see someone wearing a mask. And I have some pictures here that I would like to just show you and share with you here. These are pictures from 1918 and 1919, around World War I, and you see people wearing a mask. That was not unusual at all in the United States, in Europe. And it says, this woman's wearing a sign that says, wear a mask or go to jail. If you think the news is radical, we're watching people debating whether to wear a mask or not, whether to get vaccinated or not. Here you see somebody threatening to put people in jail, not forbid them from coming in a building, or not to, or to maybe fire them from their job. And just listen to these stats as I show you some more of these pictures here. There's some more casual pictures. Remember, this is World War I, why it still matters. There's a baseball game and the players are wearing a mask. Imagine that. And this is my favorite one here. Here you see then and now. If you look at it really closely, up top, the black and white photograph, that is a Georgia Tech football game in 1918. And just about everybody in the stand is wearing a mask. You can see somebody in uniform, a soldier wearing a mask. And then at the bottom, you see roughly that same section of the stadium, and you're seeing some people, some Georgia Tech fans, and they're wearing masks. It's a game, you know, in recent times. They reenacted this picture here. So imagine that, 1918 at a Georgia Tech football game, the crowd's masked. And then when they started letting limited numbers of people into the stands last year for games, you see some people wearing masks. And some of these people in that picture are related to the ones in the old picture. So I thought that was really neat to share with you. But before we move on, just imagine that Spanish flu epidemic and the pandemic we're in now. That one in World War I killed 50 million people worldwide. The world had a 2 billion population at the time. Imagine that. It killed 675,000 Americans. We had 105 million population then. Today the world is approaching 8 billion. 8 billion. And the United States is approaching 330 million. There's no comparison. No comparison. When you look at those numbers, COVID has killed 766,000 people as of now in the United States. It killed 675,000, the Spanish influenza epidemic did in 1918, 1919. So those numbers are fairly equal. The big difference, we had 105 million people back then. We got 330 million today. So just imagine that. If there's anything relevant about World War I to today, it could be that, the way that we have been living recently because of that epidemic. I remember when I was teaching school, and we would be studying World War I in history classes, I had this video that was a PBS video, and it was about the Spanish influenza epidemic, and it went into the details about how the war itself was blamed for helping cause and spread the flu, because you had millions of people moving across the oceans and across the continents, poor sanitation conditions. And then right at the end of that video, they showed a jet plane taking off. And they said the difference between then and now is the next pandemic is just one airliner away and a few hours away. And that was haunting then, 10, 20, 30 years ago when we were having that lesson in school, and it has come back to haunt us. It has actually happened. That warning has actually come to pass. But enough of that. I thought what I would do is explain to you in some simple terms, not really academic terms, why a war that ended over 100 years ago and was overshadowed by World War II by far would still be relevant today. And I thought I would take an approach, a laid-back approach. I've got a box here, and I just thought, why not just see what we can pull out of the box? Things that are relevant to World War I, and just go through that, and just have a little cultural literacy lesson. You know, in 1998, Dr. E.D. Hirsch came up with a book called Cultural Literacy, and basically it was about things that everybody should know, things you should have heard of, things you have heard of. Because they're so embedded in our everyday culture, cultural literacy. And you know, World War I is really big on that. It has a big legacy. And before we move into some of these other things in the box, let me just read a list here that I wrote down off the top of my head without having to look anything up. I was just thinking, you know, about World War I, what is so common from it that if I could pull it off the top of my head. Let me just go through this list, and then we'll get to our little artifacts here, I promise. But here we go. These are things related to World War I and cultural literacy. See how many of them you recognize. In Flanders Fields, All Quiet on the Western Front, A Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises, The Great Gatsby, The African Queen, The Guns of August, The Russian Revolution, Anastasia, Dr. Zhivago, Mata Hari, Rin Tin Tin, General Blackjack Pershing, Sgt York, Lawrence of Arabia, The Lost Battalion, The Harlem Hellfighters, The Red Baron, Eddie Rickenbacker, Lafayette Escadrille, I Want You, Over There, How You Gonna Keep Them Down on the Farm After They've Seen Paris, shell shock, trench foot, daylight savings time, something we just got off of last week, had its origins in World War I. No man's land, the lost generation, the American Legion, Buddy Poppy, Memorial Poppy, Versailles, Doughboy, Gas Mask, Enfield, Mauser, Springfield, Spanish influenza, the war to end all wars, slackers, the home front, the draft, Liberty loans, the Yanks are coming, walking wounded, convoy. And that's the end of my list. Those were just things that I thought about off the top of my head without having to look them up. The lesson being that those are examples of World War I cultural literacy, things that are so spoken of even today, are well ingrained in literature, pop culture, you name it, cinema, that they're on the top of our heads. So, having done that, let's see what else we can pull out of the box, shall we? Things that are very relevant today. And again, this one, Veterans Day was just yesterday. Veterans Day was just yesterday. This is an old clock that a student of mine made for a Veterans Day event probably 30 years ago. But 11 o'clock. The 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month is when we celebrate Veterans Day. And all across the country, in towns like yours, at 11 o'clock, they start the ceremony. Why? Because the armistice went into effect at 11 o'clock. The armistice went into effect on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. Sadly, we won't get into this. Fighting took place right up until practically 11 o'clock, with the last American dying at about 10:59 their time on that morning. But we think about things like the poppy every year on Veterans Day, and we observe it every year on November the 11th, which again is just one day removed from us today, this being November the 12th. So we've got people wearing masks. We've got people having a Veterans Day ceremony, which at one time was an Armistice Day ceremony until they changed the name. They all trace their roots back to World War I. The poppy. The poppy has been adopted as our Veterans Day and Memorial Day flower. And it goes back to a World War I poem that a Canadian officer wrote. And he wrote it in 1915, and Major John McCrae wrote this thing in 1915. He did not survive the war. He died near war's end of pneumonia. And his poem has been adopted as kind of the anthem of Veterans Day around the world, especially in the Western countries. And the poppy that he wrote of has become the veterans flower, thanks to some other people a few years after the war that took it up and turned it into an effort to raise money for veterans hospitals and disabled veterans. And so we see the American Legion VFW distributing poppies every year. In my town, we had a veteran ceremony this past Saturday. And I have the bulletin, and inside the bulletin is the poem in Flanders Fields. And again, you may have heard this poem read yesterday if you attended your local veteran ceremony, because every year on Veterans Day, across thousands of towns, this poem is read. And it is in my town in Thomaston, Georgia. But I'll read it. This is, remember John McCrae, the Canadian veteran, who was a World War I veteran, that wrote this poem. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt long, saw sunset glow. loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. It's kind of a haunting poem, especially when you realize that John McCrae did not survive the war, but it was a challenge to the living who had not been killed to not quit and to not let the dead's efforts have been in vain. Shortly after the war, a lady named Mona Michael wrote a response to that poem called Victory, where she answers the poem and says, "Ye have not died in vain," and goes into details because the war had been won. So, and that came about a few years after the war, where she answered McCrae's poem. So the poppy, Veterans Day ceremonies, all of that takes place every year, and it all has its origins in World War I because of the Armistice Day. Well, let's see what else we can pull out of the box. You will bear with me. This is a well-known story. You can't have World War I without it. There's the replica of the paper announcing that the Lusitania had been sunk. And you know what? Lusitania is probably second to Titanic, that other ship, as being a well-known passenger ship. Why? Because they both met a bad fate. They were very similar. They sailed in the same era. But Lusitania, there's some misconceptions about it. There are some misconceptions, and I've always called this probably the most mistaught thing about World War I. There are a lot of people that think the Lusitania sinking was kind of the Pearl Harbor for the U.S. in World War I. In other words, the Germans sank the Lusitania. 128 to 132 Americans died on it, depending on which source you're looking at. And then we suddenly and angrily declared war on Germany. I've heard that taught in classrooms before. I've seen it on some tests that were made out for school students. It's not true. Lusitania was sunk in 1915. The United States went to war in April of 1917. Not even close. Now, we protested a little bit, made some threats, but continued to tolerate Germany's unrestricted war at sea. So I just bring that up because Lusitania is one of the biggest myths about World War I. Yeah, it did sink. Yeah, it had some Americans on it, and the Germans did sink it. But that's where the truths end. Here's a good propaganda poster that came out at the time. It shows a mama holding a baby, and they've slipped beneath the waves. That's kind of like when Jack slipped beneath the waves in the movie Titanic and sunk to his death. But what that was doing was it was designed to drum up support for anti-German feelings because a German submarine had sunk the ship. And here in America, there were a lot of people wanting to go to war right then and there. Teddy Roosevelt leading the charge. In reality, things aren't that simple. We know today, and the Germans always said that Lusitania was carrying munitions. There were a lot of American industries that were selling munitions to the Allies. They couldn't really sell them to the Germans because the British Navy had the coast blockaded. We were supposed to be neutral, but the Allies controlling the seas were buying munitions from us. And we know today that Lusitania did have munitions on board, which made it really a legitimate target for the German U-boat to see. And all of the passengers that were on it had been warned duly. Before they boarded the ship, there were posters everywhere, and there was a submarine zone saying if you're on this ship, you are subject to being sunk. They took their chances. But the same technology that went down and explored the Titanic has explored the wreck of the Lusitania, and they have evidence that there were tons of munitions on board, and that's one reason when it was struck, it exploded and went down so quickly. It sunk very quickly. But Lusitania is a famous ship, mainly because it had the misfortune of being sunk. And of course, here in America, we know that a lot of American lives were lost on it. Likewise, Titanic is famous because it had the misfortune of being sunk in an unusual way. Two ships, 3 years apart, went down. And, you know, if Titanic had not hit that iceberg, she would have taken part in World War I because her two sister ships did. You had Titanic, but then you had Britannic, which was a hospital ship in World War I that was sunk after hitting a landmine. I mean, not a landmine, but a sea mine in the Mediterranean. And then Olympic, her other sister ship, which actually was at sea at the same time Titanic was, served up throughout World War I as a cargo and troop ship, and served out her service and retired in the 30s. So chances are Titanic, that other famous big ship, to Lusitania, would have been in the First World War as a troop and a cargo ship. So let's put that down and see what else we can pull out of the box. This is a good one. And again, one of the best known leftover images of World War I. Uncle Sam, I want you. We have a bigger picture of it back here. Uncle Sam, I want you. This poster was created during World War I as a recruiting poster. Montgomery Flagg, famous artist, drew it. You can see, if you look closely on the posters, you can see his name. It's always on there, Montgomery Flagg. But this was the first World War that required huge civilian armies. And so they had to get out and recruit. And the draft was used as well, only for the second time in U.S. history. But this was designed to get you to sign up. The thing about it is, it's not that original. You know, Uncle Sam was a concept that was developed in 1812, during the War of 1812. There was a man named Sam who actually was a butcher in one of the shops where they made salted meat. They would cut meat and then they would dry it for the U.S. troops. Sam Wilson was his name. And they would stamp on the boxes of those salted meat boxes, U.S., meaning United States. And the people around the warehouse got the joke, and that means Uncle Sam. And the idea spread, and so Uncle Sam became a kind of a synonym and a symbol for the United States. So when World War I came out, who better or what better image to use than Uncle Sam? But it's not that original, because guess what? The British were already using it. They had a poster before we had an Uncle Sam poster. And it shows Lord Kitchener, who was the British Secretary of War. And he's not, it doesn't say well, it says Britons, Lord Kitchener wants you. And he's pointing the same way. And then it tells you, join your country's army, God save the king. So it has a very British flavor to it. But, you know, we copied it. We basically stole the idea. It has an interesting optical illusion, excuse me. If you look up here at this poster, his eyes and his finger are always pointing at you. You can't escape it. He's pointing and looking at me right now. Wherever you are out there, he's pointing and looking at you. If I were to get on the floor, if I were to kneel, guess what? He's looking and pointing straight down at me. So I guess those slackers, and that's what they called draft dodgers back then, if you didn't want to join, you couldn't get out, you couldn't escape his eyes or his pointing finger. The posters were a big part of World War I. I love this one. another lesson in this. Look at that. Today, that would be politically incorrect. I hope I don't get thrown out of here for having it. Look at this. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it. United States Navy recruiting station. What's that? That's designed to pretty much shame you into joining up. Because if you're a man of service age in 1917, 1918, and you walk by and you see this, first of all, you see a pretty girl, and by the way, a real woman modeled for that. I read the story on it. You could research it if you like. But she's a pretty girl, and then she's saying, you know, if I were you, if I were a guy like you, that's what I'd do. I'd join the Navy. So it's kind of making you. Then it says be a man. So it's psychology. It's the psychiatric or psychological effect of a lot of the propaganda in World War I. Just like that poster I showed you of the woman drowning with her baby when they went down with the Lusitania. They're designed to get in your head, make one side look good and one side look bad. This one's trying to make the guy join up. Here you have Uncle Sam, the stern father figure, telling you to do it, and if you respect him, you'll do it. That's not good enough. Here you got the pretty girl kind of suggesting, you know, if you don't serve, then you're not going to be a very eligible bachelor. Basically, that's what it's saying without saying it. In today's military in the United States, females make up nearly 16% of our uniformed forces. So compare that with 100 years ago when she's saying, if I were a man, you know, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. And now we have lots and lots of women in the military, 15% of our service. And, you know, women played a big role in World War I long before Rosie the Riveter. In both Europe and the United States, because of a shortage of men, this was really the first time that women in large scales in the Western world went into the factories. They did so in the U.S., they did so in Europe. We hear a lot about Rosie the Riveter and women in World War II, but it really goes back to World War I. And of course, nowadays, you know, women in the workforce is taken for granted. I mean, it's just it's a reality, a huge reality. And we did have a few women that were pioneers. They were not called the WACs, but we did have some women nurses in Europe that were doing first aid and helping with the doctors. So there were a few women in the United States military in World War I. Not that many, but there were some. So let's see. We've done Uncle Sam. So let's see what else we can pull out of that box. By the way, if you were wondering about Flanders, Flanders is a section of Belgium where a lot of the war took place, and the poppies would grow wild in the field, and after a battle, the mud and the scarred earth, poppies would grow back, and that would be one of the first things growing, and they were growing in Flanders fields in Belgium, therefore the name. All right, what else can we pull out of the box here? This is a good one. Good old Sgt York, Alvin C. York. I bet you've heard of him and you've seen the movie from 1941 starring Gary Cooper, haven't you? And that's your image of Sgt York, Gary Cooper. Good movie. Who was he first? And here's a picture of him from this is a good picture of him wearing his garrison cap. That's not Gary Cooper, but it is Alvin C. York from Pell Mell, Tennessee. And he was a simple guy like most of the doughboys that fought in the war. He was a conscientious objector, but in the end, he went anyway and ended up performing this great feat that's still talked about today, and it was so interesting they made a movie out of it in 1941 with him actually advising on the set with Gary Cooper starring. he supposedly captured a ridiculous number of Germans, something like 130 something, and he killed 27 single-handedly while his unit was pinned down. He was only a corporal at the time and got promoted to be a sergeant. And he became this instant hero, so much so he got the Medal of Honor, and he got the medal that the French offered, and all this is depicted in the movie. And then he came home after the war a big hero, a big celebrity. There's a scene in the movie right at the end, and I'm talking that way because I'm assuming so many of you have seen this movie. It's been on, used to be on TBS all the time. They colorized it, by the way. But there's a scene when he's so famous, he comes back home, they offer him all this stuff to do. They offer him to endorse cereal, you know, like famous people and athletes. You'll see them on TV peddling various products. And they offered him to dance on Broadway, to be in movies. You know, he would probably be offered to be on Dancing with the Stars today if he was around today. But he was just a simple guy from Pell Mell, Tennessee, and he said, "No, I don't." In the movie, he said, "Well, I ain't never ate none of that there cereal." And he said he wanted to go home. And so he turned down all these offers, and he went home. And when he got there, the town there and the Rotarians Club there in that area of Tennessee had decided to reward him with a house. And in the movie, he had always wanted this piece of bottomland, and they knew that, and so they had purchased the bottomland for him. And then, while he was gone, they had built this house for him. And his girlfriend was Gracie. And in the movie, right at the end of the movie, they tell him to close his eyes. Gracie's going to surprise him with this house. And she says, "Now, Alvin, I want you to close your eyes and don't you be a-looking until I tell you to." And she leads him out into this field. And he says something like, "Well, Miss Gracie, I reckon I ain't got nothing to offer you but a big wedding," because they were going to pay for his wedding too. And she said, "Well, some girls don't even get that. Now, you keep your eyes closed." And then they get in front of this house, and she says, "Now look, Alvin," and he opens his eyes, and there's this beautiful white house off in the distance. She says, "It's yours, Alvin, the state of Tennessee and the people. They done give it to you for what you done over there." And he looks at it, and his eyes get big, and he says, "Well, the Lord showed us move in mysterious ways." And then they grab each other's hand, and they run towards it, and the music rises, and it says, "The end." And that's the way it ends. In reality, it wasn't quite that simple. If you read about it, that house was not completed and it was not fully paid for. There was an attempt to raise money, but they never raised enough to pay for it. And Alvin York got saddled with debt that followed him for the rest of his life almost. It was not that end of the Hollywood movie story. It was not finished. He had to finish it, and it was not fully paid for, and he got into mortgage trouble over that house. That shows you, Hollywood can do anything with the movie. You don't always believe what Hollywood says, but there's no doubt Alvin York, one of the greatest heroes in American history. But before we leave him, how about Needham Roberts? There was a unit of soldiers that fought in a black unit, and there were a couple of guys that I'll get to later, and one of them was known as the Black Sgt York, but we'll talk about him in just a minute. Let's see what else we got here. Let's pull this one out. Boy, this is, along with that Uncle Sam poster, I believe this is the most visible thing from World War I. It also, as far as cultural literacy and why it still matters, we got more on this one than anything. What in the world here? We got pizzas. We got Charlie Brown. We got a lot of stuff here, so let's get right to it. Baron von Richthofen. better known as the Red Baron. Here you see a picture of him with some of his flags. There's probably not a more famous person out of World War I than Baron von Richthofen, the Red Baron. He's been popularized, and the reason being that aviation was so new then, that was the cutting edge. You know, that was the daring thing. That was like the cavalry on horseback back in the 1800s. Anybody could be a soldier in the trenches, but to get up there and battle it out in the skies with this new technology, that's, I'm sure, why the Red Baron is so popular and so well remembered. And he's remembered because he was the top ace. When World War I ended, he had 80 kills to his credit. No other ace in any other air service in World War I had that many. Now, in World War II, there were many that went beyond that. Most of them German pilots, but we don't remember them unless you're a military history expert. These Germans that had 200 and something killed in World War II. But everybody's heard of the Red Baron, and you've heard the song, and you've seen Snoopy fighting him on Charlie Brown. But it's because he was the first super ace in history, and that's why he's remembered. He's remembered so well that you remember the song about him. It was a hit back in the 60s, and then there was even a sequel, a Christmas version of it. But, you know, let me make you cringe. Let me sing a line from it. You probably remember it when it was on the radio, and you'll hear its sequel this Christmas if you listen to the radio when they sing the Christmas version of it, where Snoopy and the Red Baron meet up and share a Christmas toast. But let me just commit heresy and sing one line of it. It went 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 or more. The bloody Red Baron was rolling up the score. 80 men died trying to end that spree. The bloody Red Baron of Germany. A lot of you are showing your age because you remember that song. Here we have the dashing images that made the aerial services of World War I so glamorous, in a war that was by no way glamorous, and in reality not even in the air. When people are fighting and killing each other and dying, it's really not glamorous, and the veterans will tell you that. But nothing's been romanticized more than the air war in World War I, and that's why the Red Baron is the same way. Even, you know, if you can't even watch Charlie Brown's Great Pumpkin Story without coming across the Red Baron. He's in here. And Snoopy, I was watching this just a few weeks ago. I watch it every year come Halloween time, and then I saw this book in the store. I thought I'll get that to use for this program. But look at that. There's Snoopy with his scarf and his goggles, and it says right here, Snoopy walks by, also dressed in a costume. Who in the world is that? Asked Lucy. He's a World War I flying ace, Charlie Brown explains. Now I've seen everything, Lucy says. And then they go on to, in the original Charlie Brown, they go on to do some combat in the skies with Snoopy on his doghouse. So even a children's cartoon, a classic cartoon, you can't get away from the Great War, World War I, that ended over 100 years ago. You can't go to the supermarket without seeing references to the Red Baron. Look at this. You go to the frozen food section, and there's Red Baron pizza products and other Italian food. I bet you some of y'all have it in your freezer right now. Red Baron pizza. And they have a picture of this dashing pilot on there with a scarf. And that's designed to tell you that just as Red Baron was classy and elite, so is his pizza. You know, they call this lunch and learn. So I reckon I better eat some. I brought some of that Red Baron pizza, just a little bit. And I've got, this is lunch and learn. So, I baked this last night and just the rest of it's waiting on me when I get home. But, you know, pretty good. Red Baron pizza. You ought to, if you haven't had any, try it, and there are the products too. Okay, if you'll bear with me, I won't eat the rest of it. I'm tempted to, but I'll wait. We got to move on. America's answer to the Red Baron, Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was America's first famous ace. We had a few other aces. He had 26 kills to his credit in World War I. He was given the Medal of Honor. He joined the war late as the United States did. That's why the numbers are not nearly as impressive as, say, the Red Baron, who had 80. But he is our answer to it. He also was a key to founding Eastern Airlines in Atlanta after the war. He continued on with his interest in aviation after the war. So there's Eddie Rickenbacker, America's answer. And again, you have these other characters that don't seem to get the attention. America's first black fighter pilot, in fact, the first black fighter pilot in the world was Eugene Bullard, who fought in World War I and World War II. He fought with the French first before fighting with the Americans, mainly because the Americans wouldn't let him. But look up Eugene Bullard and find out about a hero of 2 world wars. I did not have a picture of him, but I do have something else coming up. Let me put away all this Red Baron stuff and see what else I can pull out the box here. In fact, I've already pulled it out. This is an interesting story. Here you see some African American troops you heard when I read that cultural literacy thing, you heard me say Harlem Hellfighters. They were the famous 369th Infantry out of New York, an all-black unit. They had white officers, but they were all-black combat troops, sometimes called the Rattlesnake Brigade. And they fought in France, and they fought first with the French, wearing French uniform and French guns before they were fully integrated into the United States Army. And they were under fire longer than any other unit. They went in and joined the French trenches before the United States units really got into the thick of the fighting. So they're said to have been under the gun longer than any other unit, the Harlem Hellfighters. They had a fabulous band that led the armistice, the Victory Parade down in New York City after the war. Their famous band was popular all over Europe. They had among them the so-called Black Sgt York, Private Henry Johnson, who part of that unit did some, he and another man named Hiram Roberts did some really heroic things as well, and were held up in high esteem by the fighting 369th. But they were among this unit here, and they don't get the publicity, and they don't have the movies. There has been a movie about the 369, but you don't hear about it the way you do the Sgt York movie. So, you know, the black story in World War I is a big one. It was largely supported. There was a lot of support among the black community and black leaders for the war, because they saw it as a way of achieving equality after the war. And then when it didn't happen, World War II came along, and there was it was kind of this feeling that it's not going to happen again. And that's why the civil rights movement, you see it taking off after World War II. Because in 2 world wars, African Americans had fought and died, and yet didn't have full freedoms in their own country. But World War I, the roots of the civil rights movement in many ways finds its way back through World War I because of that concept. We'll prove ourselves, we'll do our duty, and we will be rewarded after the war. Let's see what else we can pull out of this box. you can't talk World War I without this novel. In fact, when I was in college, you couldn't go through Western Civ without having to read this. All Quiet on the Western Front. It was written by a German veteran of the war, Erich Remarque, who had survived the war. The book came out in 1928. It's been published in many languages. The German Nazis banned it in during the World War II era because they were afraid it might stir up anti-war sentiment. The French, needing manpower in World War I, had some bans on it during the war because the French, more than any of the other major powers, was being bled white, and they were afraid that this book, which was not glorifying the war, it was showing the harsh realities of the average foot soldier, not the big generals, not the big time names, but just average foot soldiers. And the star in this book, his name is Paul. Should you ever read the book or see the movie, I won't tell you what happens in it, except that it is a very realistic novel called the most realistic war novel ever. It was a 1930s movie, got Best Picture that year in the early years of the talkies. I remember when I was at Georgia in 1979, a television version of it came out, a color updated television version. So it's been made into movies a few times, but that original one still is famous. It won Best Motion Picture for 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front. I pulled this out. This was in a paper a while back. It says it had a list of the American Film Institute's top 100 films. And as I'm looking at it, it's got Citizen Kane, #1. But as I look at it, number 54, All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930, of the American Film Institute's top 100 movies. Let's see what else might be on there about World War I. Number 17, The African Queen, a World War I story. Number 39, Dr. Zhivago, a fabulous movie, another World War I story. So 3 World War I oriented movies are on that top 100 list, including All Quiet on the Western Front. Well, let's see. I'll quickly hold this up. This is just a CD or DVD, whatever they call those things. It had World War I songs on it. And, you had those little scratchy phonographs back then, and just a little bit of radio. Radio was in its infancy, but if you were to listen to this, it says 20 of your favorites. If you were to listen to it, some of the biggies are on there, like Over There. Send the word. Over there, the Yanks are coming. It's got, It's a Long Way from Tipperary, which was a British tune. It's got Mademoiselle from Armitaires. It's got all those goodies on it. So World War I music is out there, and you can order DVDs or it's CDs, I think, that will have it on there. You can probably just Google it and listen to it straight off the line. What else can we pull out of the bag? Well, let's see. This is an interesting one here. It's kind of bulky. We'll start with Lawrence of Arabia. Look at that. Another one of those epic movies, right in there with Dr. Zhivago. Fabulous movie. If you've ever seen it, you better sit down and prepare to stay a while if you ever do, because it's a long one, just like Dr. Zhivago. But T.E. Lawrence, he was a British officer in the war, and he was assigned to the Middle East theater, where there was a lot of fighting going on down in North Africa and in the Middle East. And even in South Africa, where the African Queen story takes place, because those were colonies. And World War I was in part about competition for overseas empire. That's why Africa was involved. Well, he was a colonel during the war, and he was sent down there, and he specialized in dealing with the people, the native people, and he would dress and embed himself with the Bedouin people and the Arab peoples, and he tried to convince the Allies toward war's end, during the war and afterward, that, you know, there was a way to be fair in the Middle East when they ran the Turks, who had been controlling the Middle East for a long time, and who were allies with the Germans. When they ran the Ottoman Turks out, they had to redraw the map there. And the British and the French had been telling the natives there, help us, and after the war, we will give you your freedom. You'll have nationhood. And they were telling everybody that, the Jewish people too. And Lawrence felt like they were betrayed. But if you look at the problems in the Middle East today, if the peacemakers had listened to T.E. Lawrence and his advice about drawing the map in Europe, I don't know that these wars in the Middle East that we're so used to would have happened. And the man I heard talk last Saturday in our veterans program, who had been embedded with the Afghan people in Afghanistan, much the same way T.E. Lawrence was on a smaller scale, said the same thing. They tried to divide the Middle East, places like Iraq and Iran, and they tried to divide those places down a line and let the British have a mandate over part of it, the French a mandate over part of it. Those people, it was an artificial line. They didn't know anything about the culture. And T.E. Lawrence may have been the example of the lost peace, because he knew the people there, the Bedouin people, and had they listened to him, like I'm saying, I don't know that we would have all the problems in the Middle East that we have today. The Middle East problems go back thousands of years, that's true. But today's modern Middle East politics and tension goes straight back to World War I and the failures at the peacemakers at Versailles when they came up with the treaty. It was their failures. Let's see, you want more intrigue. Lawrence of Arabia is intrigue, and this is too. How about Mata Hari? Probably the world's most famous spy, a Dutch lady. And she went by the name Mata Hari when she became a dancer. I'm talking behind the thing here, but I think the picture looks better than I do, so I'll keep hiding behind it. But it means eye of the, let's see, eye of the dawn. Eye of the dawn is what Mata Hari means, but she was a Dutch woman. She married, and then she and her husband went to Indonesia and spent some time there. And she learned to dance there. Learned to be an exotic dancer. And after she divorced, she moved to France and lived in Paris and became a well-known exotic dancer. When the war started, both sides were looking for ways to deceive and to have spies. And of course, attractive women were seen as a way to maybe get into the heads and seduce mentally higher ups on the other side. And Mata Hari was believed to have been a spy for the Germans and the Allies. Now the French executed her for spying for the Germans. And there's a lot of belief to this very day that she was not as guilty. I read where she was not even a good spy, not even an effective spy. But that the French were looking for propaganda and that they needed a scapegoat on a national scale, and so they executed Mata Hari by firing squad with, to drum up anti-German and pro-French sentiment. Again, a movie was made in 1931 about Mata Hari, starring, believe it or not, Greta Garbo. That would have been a good one. I've never seen it, but I believe I'd like to. But again, intrigue. I remember back in the 80s, I used to watch Fantasy Island, and they would always go back in time, and one time, Tattoo and the other guy, they were back in Paris during World War I, and there was Mata Hari, and they were trying to save her. So even on Fantasy Island, we had Mata Hari. All right, let's see if we can move on. This is getting a little more serious. You look at what came out of World War I, that would have a huge impact later, although I'm sure they didn't know it at the time. This is Harry Truman. He was an artillery officer during World War I. He must have been a good one because he never lost a man. He never lost a single man under his command. And he, of course, we know, went on later to be vice president and then president and had a very big role in the next World War. There's no way he could have known that in 1918 as a lowly artillery officer. But he was president when we had our final victory pushes in Europe and then in the Pacific, made perhaps the biggest single decision ever made by a human being when he gave the orders to drop the atomic bombs, things that would have been unheard of in World War I. And not just to you and me, but to him as well. So the most powerful leader toward the end of the next war, in the United States, and really in the whole world, right in there with Stalin and Churchill, was Harry Truman, a lowly artillery officer in World War I. And then this, that Bavarian corporal, Adolf Hitler, a lowly corporal, fought pretty well in World War I. He was known for his bravery. He was gassed. He suffered a gas attack and suffered a lot of time in field hospital. And he never really got over the loss. There was this big betrayal among a lot of Germans that the government had betrayed him. The army didn't lose the war. Technically, they really didn't. They were never really defeated on the battlefield. They were sold out by the politicians. And that's the reason you had rise of some of these extremist groups after the war. The Nazis, the communists, all running around vying for power in post-war Europe. And Hitler took him a while, but through ups and downs, he rose through the ranks, and you know the rest of the story. Helped bring on World War II, and one of the biggest villains in history, responsible for many, many, many deaths. But he was right there in the trenches. Just like Harry Truman, they both ended up being the leaders of two major combating nations in the next war. So just think about that. Let's see what else we can pull out of this bag. We're getting toward the end. Here's an interesting story that is not that far removed from us. Not that far removed. It's 10 years ago. 10 years ago, again, just 10 years ago, the last American soldier from World War I was still alive, Frank Buckles. Frank Buckles. He lived to be 111. He was. He also served in World War II in a different role, but here he is. And this is a picture of him in uniform when he was a doughboy. Here is a picture of him a year or two before he died. We can zoom in on that. He was the subject of a lot of magazines in his final years because he was still alive. And the VFW and American Legion magazines all covered him. I can remember in 2008, when I was teaching, I had a class, it was an ethnic studies class, and I got some of them to do a skit that where we reenacted Frank Buckles and the armistice coming up, and I got the smartest guy in the school to play him, to play Frank Buckles, and we did the whole tour, Sertoma, Lions Club, Veterans, Kiwanis, we did all of that stuff, doing this thing, and he played the role of Frank Buckles, where he was speaking to him from 1918 in his doughboy suit, but he knew everything up through 2008. It was, and then I remember when Frank Buckles died, this boy was at the University of Georgia. I sent him a text. Every year I'd send him on Frank Buckles' birthday, I would send him a happy birthday. And then when he died, I sent him a message of sympathy there because he had played Frank Buckles. Here's again a German counterpart. It's always important to look at the enemy, I guess not as the enemy, but as a fellow human being. We tend to demonize the enemy, and that's what propaganda does. But in the end, soldiers will tell you that the other guy's just a regular guy, just like he is. I remember talking to some World War II veterans, and I said, what about the Germans that y'all saw, the captured Germans? What did y'all think of it? He said, oh, they were just like us. And so that's the reason I kind of like to do this sometime, but this is the last of the Germans that survived, Erich Kostner. And again, he served in World War I, but he also served as an anti-aircraft soldier for the Luftwaffe in World War II. He became a lawyer, a judge. And let's see, he's of course passed on now, but he lived on just like Frank Buckles did. He died, see if I wrote, he was 107 when he passed away. So this is not that far removed from us. It's hard to remember. It's hard to believe. That would be like in the 1940s and 50s, Civil War soldiers still being alive. And there were a few of them right up to the mid-20th century, because I remember seeing an article about the last Gettysburg reunion. So it did happen. So even the people that fought in that war were not that far removed from today. The British, here's their guy was Harry Patch. I don't have a good picture of him, but I do have the article. He was the last veteran from the British armies, and he died. Says he was 111, and he died in 2009. Harry Patch. So they're all gone. They're all gone, but it hasn't been that long ago. Hasn't been that long ago. What else as we wind this thing down? What can we pull out of here? A lot of people talk about the Christmas truce. That seems to have captured people's fancy. The Christmas truce of 1914, which occurred during that first Christmas when the war itself was only a few months old, but it had settled down into a stalemate. It had begun in August when everybody thought it would be over in a few weeks or months. By December and Christmas time, everything it seemed had bogged down. But the Christmas truce, like I said, I don't have any pictures of it, but I can tell you a story about it. And in 2009, I had some students in that same subject class. We reenacted the Christmas truce, and we had some Germans because we had a German class at the high school at the time, so they were able to speak real German. And we reenacted the Christmas truce, and again made the circuit all over the service groups in Thomaston putting that on. But the Christmas truce is an example of, if you look at the German troops and the British troops who yesterday were shooting and killing each other, and tomorrow they're doing the same thing, but for a brief time were able to share some fellowship together in no man's land, which again, I think the real lesson of the Christmas truce, it not only shows you the power of the Christmas spirit and all that stuff, but it shows you the stupidity and the futility of war, I think. It really does. But Christmas truce has become popular, and every year around Christmas time you hear of it, and there have been some songs about it. So what are we going to pull out of here next? We're getting toward the end. What about animals? All you animal lovers out there. We got some of that. Here's Share Our Meat, which means my friend. It's a pigeon, a carrier pigeon. that's now in the Smithsonian. This is a carrier pigeon, and in World War I, like I said, radio was in its infancy, and they used runners, people that ran along and carried messages, but they also used pigeons, homing pigeons, and they would attach messages to. This particular one was attached to the Lost Battalion, I'll call it. That's what it's known as. During the Meuse-Argonne battle, they were surrounded deep in some woods, and they were getting shelled by their own people. The American artillery was shelling them. They kept sending these pigeons up that were trained to fly back to headquarters, say, quit shelling us, and we need rescue. Most of them, they were all getting shot down. And they got down to this last one, and it got through, although it got a foot shot off, a leg, it's missing a leg. But it came through and brought the message, and they quit shooting their own guy and eventually rescued the Lost Battalion. And that's another interesting story to read deeply into. I won't get deeply into it, but this pigeon is at the Smithsonian. It was given several medals. It died, I believe, in 1921, and it's under a dome, a glass dome in the Smithsonian Institute. I had a student one time that won a trip to Washington through Scholastic Magazine, and they were going to go to the Smithsonian that summer. And I said, please, if you go to Smithsonian, find that pigeon. I want to know if it's really there, because this article said it is. This is an old article out of the VFW magazine. She found it and took a picture of it. It's there, under the glass dome. This guy is there too, Sergeant Stubby. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sergeant Stubby before, but he was a stray dog that became a mascot of an American unit. And he's called the most decorated war dog in World War I. Here you see him with a medal around his neck. He was in 17 battles, and he actually captured a German one time, according to the records, by grabbing him by the seat of his pants. He saved his unit several times by detecting poison gas. That was one of his jobs, detecting poison gas. Also locating wounded, and that's Sergeant Stubby. And you can't move along talking about war animals in World War I without talking about Rin Tin Tin, a German Shepherd. He was discovered in France on the battlefield in a torn up kennel where the Germans had a bunch of dogs for war dogs, and it had been bombed out, and the only survivors were a mama dog and a litter of puppies. This dog was one of the litter, and several of the troops got him. This particular one became, again, sort of a mascot, and they named him Rin Tin Tin. They snuck him home, and his owner lived in Texas, and he became a movie star, first at the local level on stage, and became a movie star. And well into the 1950s, there were 4 reincarnations, all descendants of the original Rin Tin Tin. But he was in movies all the way into the 30s. He died in 1932, and then there was a Rin Tin Tin 2, 3, and 4. When I was a child, I remember watching the television series Rin Tin Tin. It was a 1950s television series that they were showing in reruns on TV. So the bloodline continues to this day. Out in Texas, there's a family that claims they've got descendants of Rin Tin Tin. What's his biggest legacy? He's credited with popularizing the German Shepherd as a pet in the United States because he appeared in movies and people wanted that. So he made the German Shepherd popular as an American pet. Now, I think it would be appropriate to finish up this way. Yesterday, as you know, was Veterans Day, and every year they lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Well, yesterday, November the 11th, 2021, was the 100th anniversary of the laying to rest of the original unknown soldier in Arlington. It took place on Veterans Day. They called it Armistice Day back then, but it was a World War I American soldier. And what they did, the Americans noticed that the British and the French had these monuments to the unknown. We didn't have one. And so they decided they would create an unknown tomb, and they gave this American enlisted man, they wanted it to be a regular soldier, not an officer. They gave him the job of picking out the unknown soldier. They dug up or exhumed 4 coffins from American cemeteries over in France. They were all unknown soldiers, and they put them in draped coffins, and there were 4 of them, and he was told to choose one, and he circled these 4 coffins about 3 times. He had a bouquet of white roses, and he randomly put the white roses on top of a coffin. That became the unknown soldier. And with great fanfare, he was brought back to the United States aboard the USS Olympia and laid to rest in an Armistice Day ceremony at Arlington 100 years ago yesterday. President Warren G. Harding gave the address. General Pershing, John J. Pershing, who commanded the American forces in Europe, was there as well. And it's been guarded nonstop ever since then. And there are 2 more in there, a World War II, a Korean War one. For a while they had a Vietnam veteran one, and I won't go that far into it, but he's no longer there, and they're not going to put any more in there because of modern day forensic capabilities. They say there won't be another unknown. But as the inscription says on the tomb, known but to God. You have these unknown soldiers, known but to God. So this, as recently as yesterday, again, all across the country, World War I was still relevant, with Veterans Day services, poppies being distributed, and people wearing them, and our president of today, President Biden, visiting the Tomb of the Unknown. All this stuff took place. And remember, that original Tomb of the Unknown was a World War I veteran, so it still matters. And with that, the box is empty. And I guess, Penny, you told me that we might have questions?
Yes.
Well, I hope I have the answers for you.
We have an overview question. John said, this was a nice overview presentation, thank you. Do you have anything to say regarding the German settlement with the Russian Soviets and the impact of the conflicts in Eastern Europe?
It sounds like he's talking about what happened. The Russian Revolution came along while the war was still going on. And, the Tsar was losing his influence, and people were rebelling. And so that gave the communists, the Bolsheviks, a way to step in and say, look, put us in power and you'll get land, peace, and bread. Everybody wants land. They certainly wanted peace. I think it was peace, land, and bread, and you got to eat. And so the communists, the war itself gave them a chance to kind of come on the scene and say, we'll offer something better. And to get out of the war, they made a separate treaty with Germany, in which, Germany was able to get a lot of land in Eastern Europe. And then later on, when Stalin comes along and he's got a lot of power, and the Soviet Union is beginning to gain a lot of power and influence, they started coveting some of that land again. And so in a way, it created some of the tensions that led to World War II. But yeah, Germany, the Allies felt like Russia had betrayed them. In fact, we had troops in Russia. We had troops in Archangel and several places several years after the war. And the Soviets always felt betrayed because they thought, y'all were against us from the beginning. But it all goes back to that separate treaty that Germany made and Russia made, because Russia wanted out of the war so quickly. And so they kind of sold the Allies out and gave Germany some land, and it caused trouble later. I hope that answered the question.
We have Andrew Brown that says, thank you for the presentation. And we have one more question. How was the pizza?
Well, It may not be as good as Domino's, but I don't know. I won't tell you nothing like it, you know. After that, it's cold pizza, but other than that, it's pretty good.
I think that's it.
Is there anything still, are we still on the air?
Yep, I'm going to come up
Well,
here.
let me close with one quick story.
Yes, go ahead.
There was a famous painting called My Grandfather's War. And it shows an old man in his doughboy suit. And for a lot of us, it really was our grandfather's war. It was my grandfather's war. And I do remember, he died when I was only 8, but I do remember discussing it with him. He told me that on the ship that they went over to Europe on, and I can still see myself sitting by him in a folding chair in front of the house at Granny's. He said on the ship, when he went over there, a man got sick. And he threw up, and he threw up, and he threw up. He used a different word that I won't use here because it's a little cruder, but he said he just threw up, and he threw up, and he threw up. Well, about 3 years ago, my niece, my sister's daughter, did some research on him. William Cox was his name, and you can look up every troop, see if you know how to do it. And they'll tell you what branch they were in, and he'll tell you what ship they went over on, and all this kind of stuff. Well, I found out that Granddaddy went over on the Leviathan. Leviathan was a German ship that had been captured, interned in New York, or interned by the Allies, and it was converted into an Allied troop ship that carried American troops. I was very familiar with Leviathan because you pick up any good World War I book, you'll see Leviathan and it's 1,000 of troops on deck. But it was a captured German passenger liner of the era. And it said that he went over on the Leviathan, and that voyage, that cruise, they got there in very early November, not far from the armistice. 300 people died of the Spanish flu on that cruise. And again, when you go back to him talking about people throwing up, and I've always thought it was seasickness, but now I'm wondering, did they have the flu? He was talking about all the people that got sick on that cruise, and you can go online today and find out little things like that. So again, I guess it still matters.
Thank you, Gary. I've known Gary for quite a few years and always gives wonderful presentations. Thank you. Coming up December, we have 2 programs. The first is on Friday, December the 3rd, and then another on Friday, December the 10th. On Friday, December the 3rd at noon, State Archivist and Assistant Vice Chancellor of the University System of Georgia, Chris Davidson, will give a brief overview of the history of the Georgia Archives and then focus on recent activities and plans for the next year, appropriately called the Georgia Archives, a brief overview and update. On Friday, December 10th, our lunch and learn program will be A History of Christmas Traditions by Andrew Bramlett. We all know Santa, Christmas trees, and Rudolph, but do you know where they came from? Many classic Christmas traditions have fascinating origins, from Norse legends to marketing gimmicks. This unique presentation covers these fascinating stories, along with other Christmas traditions from the past. Now look for these links to both of these presentations on the Georgia Archives website. And once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.